what we want to do is we want to just remember that we shouldn't despair, that God is with us, that God is always reaching out to us, that we're not left on our own to try to figure this stuff out, to drift into some sort of super masculine ideology, which, becomes really unpleasant and something like that, but to be grounded in that transcendent purpose that God gives us. We don't give it to ourselves. We don't invent it in the absence of obvious patterns of living our life, but God gives it to us to live our lives for communion with Him and for love for our neighbor as ourself. And that is found in traditional Christianity. And I think a lot of what men are facing today in the world that we live in, 21st century America, Denmark, anything in the West, is that we've been through so many phases of disintegration, beginning with secularization. Let's point to that, and this counterfeit model of life that I call utopia, that has played itself out in movements, that are like feminism, for instance, has really confused a lot of where the place of the man is in our society. And then the transgender movement today is, of course, even more bizarre than anything, even the most radical feminism could have ever achieved. We need to return to a deep past, to that deep past in which a healthy culture of the West was to be found in man's communion with God.
Father John Strickland, good to see you in person.
Good to be with you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I've been reading I'm on the fourth volume of your Paradise and Utopia series of books. I got two of them just over there. I think you can see them, right? And one there, I think Age of Nihilism is right next to my bed at the moment, and my wife's just started with Age of Paradise, so that's on her bedside table at the moment. But we've been really enjoying reading them, and so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, yeah. So we're thinking of the title for this conversation of why men must master history. And I think we're living in a time where, at least for myself, I can really see the value of understanding, if not all the details, at least the broad sweeps of history, and not trying to do so really from a too scientific point of such, but actually having a place where one knows where one stands and some kind of, instead of like some approach to neutrality or something like that.
Yeah.
So can you tell me, why do you think it's important for men to have an understanding of history?
Yeah. Yeah, right. I think we need to have more, or actually much more than just a neutral attitude toward the world around us. I think that's part of the problem of the culture we live in today. I think men should have an understanding of history just because they're part of the human race. That makes them part of a culture, along with women who should have an understanding of history. To be human is to be part of a community, and communities are shaped and become healthy and live out a healthy community life insofar as they share common beliefs and values that have a heritage whose history, whose story is well known to them. And it's often commented that here in America, anyway, people have really lost a sense of history, really lost that sense of history. And what I think is important as an Orthodox Christian, I'm an Orthodox Christian priest, is for us to have a sense of history that not only explains some of the things that have been happening recently, and for Orthodox, recently as can be hundreds and hundreds of years old, but we have an understanding of the history of the West in which we live that stretches back to the origins of that West, of that civilization, with its supporting culture that explains how we got to where we are today. If today a lot of people say, men among them, that there are big problems in the West, that it's hard to live a healthy life in the culture of the West, my point would be then let's understand the history better. Let's delve into the past. Let's delve into what I call the deep past, not the sexual revolution alone, not the Enlightenment, so-called, alone, not the Protestant Reformation alone, or other things in the late Middle Ages, so-called alone, but to go into the deep past, and that is for me as an Orthodox Christian, that means the first millennium. The second millennium has a very interesting history. I tell it in a couple of my volumes, but first that first millennium is where I really think we need to start, and where we really need to understand what it means to be a member of this Western civilization in which we live. And that goes for men as well as women. And I think men really need to think about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember just like you kind of have this idea of the Dark Ages, and there was like classical Greece, and then there was this Dark Ages, and then somehow like the Reformation happened. That was very much my schooling that I got, right. That you had these
Yeah.
cavemen that were running around basically with axes and making out tools or something like that. Where did you get this idea from of going into the deep past? Like where did that come from?
Well, I grew up, of course, in the West. I grew up in California, Southern California. I mean, I was much a part of, modern culture as anyone. And I got interested in history and started studying history. I was interested in the history of Christendom, of Christian civilization. That ultimately brought me to the history of Russia, which was my main focus as a graduate student, where I earned a doctorate, PhD, and went on to write about that and teach that at colleges, and along with the broader history of the West. And I think, what got me way back into the past was, as an Orthodox Christian, I converted to Orthodoxy along the way as a graduate student. The first millennium is often ignored. I mean, if as I was studying the West, as I was writing about the West, as I was teaching about the West in college courses, the first millennium is largely forgotten. And when it's discussed, and of course, some university curricula will have a kind of an obligatory course on, like, the classical, so-called classical or medieval periods. We should talk about what those actually mean. Um, they would always look at it from a Western point of view as really the history of everything, largely excluding the East, the Christian East, that is, Eastern Christendom.
Mhm.
And so, as an Orthodox Christian studying all of this, I became more and more fascinated with, like, not only the more recent second millennium, everything that's been happening in the past 1,000 years, but what happened in those first 1,000 years to shape the culture that we're in today. And so it was inevitable. I mean, the more I taught, the more I was convinced that the problems and questions that we have today about our culture, these are going to find solutions as we delve into that deep past
Mhm.
and understand where we are today in relationship to, in a story about, in a narrative about how we got from that to where we are today,
Mhm.
rather than just kind of think about things and pull out our hair and jump up and down and get worked up about what's going on around us. There's a lot to get worked up about for sure, but we'll understand that better if we really go into that deep past.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about when I read your books, and I've really found like it incredibly value as you speak about having that broad strokes and that connected, you could call it universal history, to use a term being used by Jonathan Vigor at the moment, of the way that things are put together. But what I noticed about reading your book is it's historical work. It's a historical telling of what's happened, but from a very explicitly Orthodox perspective. When I initially came into the Orthodox Church, then I was kind of told the standard work to start with reading is The Orthodox Church by Bishop Caliostos Ware. And I read that book and I've appreciated it. And I found incredibly valuable. But I kind of feel like he's to a greater extent trying to adhere to kind of Western standards of scholarly writing, at least more than you were doing, trying to be very neutral in his description of things, where you're clearly a priest. You're writing this, and there's passages which I find incredibly spiritually uplifting in some ways as well. And so I don't know. Can you talk a little bit about how or why you decided to write in that way?
Sure. Well, you mentioned Metropolitan Callistos. Yeah, he was not only a priest but a bishop, and he wrote spiritually uplifting passages too. And I have to say with you, Paul, my first introduction in a literary sense with Orthodoxy, at some level anyway, was that book. I was a graduate student and visited a Russian monastery. I was in America still at that point before I moved to Russia. And this book was just given to me as a kind of gift after I attended the Divine Liturgy that day. And I read it and I thought, wow, this is great stuff. And I really want to learn more about
Yeah.
this. You're right. He's very objective. He's very scholarly. He's very and he presents Orthodox Christianity in a very, winsome way. I mean, anyone can really appreciate what he has to say. And he was a wonderful scholar when he was alive and did many good things. And many of us came to learn more about Orthodoxy through his writing. He himself a convert there in England. For me, my approach, I would say my approach is more like in the tradition of the apology or apologia, the defense of what is orthodoxy. And I do this in a sense because I live in a country, America, the United States of America, where the great majority of people are not Orthodox Christians, of course. We're a very, very tiny, 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 tiny part of the population. And even those who are Christians, very good people who come from a Roman Catholic or Protestant background and have done a lot to help America be a Christian land, a land in which Christendom flourishes and has flourished. And I mean, I can go out into the society I live in, and I can talk to people and interact with people from these Roman Catholic, Protestant backgrounds and be, blessed by the fact that they're there doing their thing. There are
Yeah.
for instance,
People know the
demonstrations.
Bible. Like you in Denmark, like people, it's like Easter. What is Easter now again? Like what it's seriously at that level here sometimes. So
Right. Yeah. So
their
I'm really
Christianity actually has a
grateful.
voice in the public space.
I'm really grateful for that contribution Protestants and Roman Catholics have made to the culture of the United States of America. But as someone who was once Protestant and became Orthodox, I have a real fascination with, okay, so there are all these different options here, and Orthodoxy is kind of like the best kept religious secret in the West. But I obviously I'm a priest. I have a conviction that this is the true faith, this is the true church, that non-Orthodox Christians, participate in the same beliefs that we believe in some ways, but that we have been blessed to have as Orthodox the fullness of the faith, and I want to share that obviously, and I think we're at a time now, Paul, more directly to your point. If Metropolitan Callistos was writing in the 1960s, and that's kind of when his first edition, I think it was first edition was early 60s of the Orthodox Church. I think things are a lot different now.
Mhm.
I think things have changed quite a bit. And I think the culture of the West today is much more in immediate need of clarity and vigor. I want to emphasize the word vigor here, a vigorous presentation of what we believe as Orthodox, not only about doctrines or maybe worship and morality. And as an Orthodox Christian, I certainly believe that the Orthodox Church, keeps intact the not only the doctrines of the apostles, but also the morality, what it means to be male or female or have a marriage, for instance, and also the worship, even though the same worship we do today is not exactly what Paul was doing in the first century. It's essentially the same liturgical sacramental worship. And I think that we've kept that alive, and because of that conviction today with our pluralism, a pluralism that Metropolitan Callistos, when he wrote that book, just wasn't confronted by. He was talking to Anglicans, a lot of Anglicans anyway, who believed a lot of the same things he believed, and there was a lot of dialogue back then with between different Christians. Today, I think as an Orthodox, it's time for us to be much more vigorous. And that's why it's an apology rather than just an academic work of showing history, kind of take it or leave it. It's kind of interesting. No, it's a presentation of why the Orthodox faith offers to the West today, after 2 millennia, a really important, I would even say, salvific message for cultural renewal.
I really like that, and I think that's a great message for people listening to this podcast to take with them. That there's a time for vigor has come in some way. Like I often wonder, like, how is it that this faith, this, this amazing treasure in some ways, has been hidden from us Westerners for all of this time, and then now suddenly it's coming flowing in to. Oh, I can see we're getting joined by someone, so I'm gonna have to get them into the oh, there we go. Yeah, so suddenly all now it's flowing into the culture, and it's suddenly opened a veil to us. And me and my wife, we often look at each other when we come out of a liturgy, and we're like, this is crazy, this is amazing. Like, how did God choose us to get to
Yeah.
know this when our parents, I have a father who's deeply pious and really done everything he could to serve God in the Protestant church that he's a member of all of his life.
Yeah.
But he was never he had never heard of orthodoxy, right? There's no way he could get these kinds of things. So yeah, it's interesting times we're living in. Absolutely interesting times.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it is time for us to speak very directly and in a very positive, rather than neutral way about what we believe.
Good. So, um, let's dive a little bit into the content of your 4 volume work then. And maybe you can, in broad strokes, explain this. You divide basically history from Pentecost till today into 4 main periods of paradise, division, utopia, and nihilism. Can you give us the high level explanation of why you use those 4 categories to understand the last 2,000 years of deep history?
Yeah, yeah. This book series is the really the fruit of well, about a quarter century of research and teaching, and then was kind of formulated within a podcast by us by the same title, Paradise and Utopia, that Ancient Faith Radio hosts. But it really goes much beyond that. It's not just a book version of that podcast. It's kind of like the final product. The podcast is kind of a messy, research-centered kind of, reflection. I call it a researcher's notebook.
Right.
Um, the book series, the 4 volumes, they just kind of fit together. And so, yeah, there's 4 volumes, Age of Utopia being the first. It covers the whole first millennium, which, as I say, is the starting point if we really want to understand what the West once was. That's the subtitle, The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was. Because the West once was Christendom, and it was a Christendom that East and West had a common faith. There was no division at that time between a Roman Catholic West and an Orthodox East. Um, and it had its origins, I argue, in Pentecost. If I'm telling the history of Christendom, for some people, Christendom is like this political system where the state, the government, authorizes one or more forms of Christianity. And a lot of people say Christendom had its origins in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. That is not at all what I argue. Christendom is a civilization with a supporting culture that directs its people, its members toward the spiritual transformation of the world. And that's my rather complex, kind of highly packed definition of Christendom. But this is already there in Pentecost. And so I start with that event, and I argue that for 300 years, there was a kind of a proto-civilization being formed, with a kind of subculture in the parish churches of and the Christian life of the early Christians from Pentecost forward. So for 300 years, you've got in that first volume, you've got the formation of a kind of a primordial Western civilization, a primordial Christendom. And of course, it expands greatly after it becomes legalized by Constantine. And so from then on, it really, flourishes. But it's not really new. What's going on is just a working out of what I call the very cosmologically positive or affirmative elements of primordial Christendom. From Pentecost forward, and this is one of the things that I'll pick up on in volume 2, the church presented an attitude toward the world, the cosmos, which on the one hand was quite definitely suspicious and you might say negative in a sense, like the world is not what the Christian lives for. That'll come in the age of utopia. But at the same time, the world has received heaven in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. And with the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, that's all fulfilled in the fact that now Christians are bringing the kingdom of heaven into this world through their especially liturgical and sacramental worship. And so from throughout that first volume, I really emphasize what's dear to an Orthodox Christian for sure, and that is the importance of liturgy, the importance of regular transformative worship. Something you just referred to when you were talking about you and your wife leaving, the liturgy and thinking, how was I blessed to be able to receive this? We Orthodox really do believe that about our services, that they are transformative.
Yeah. And the word you use is paradise, right? So when you talk
Yeah.
about transformative, it's like, yeah, okay, maybe you can explain how the word paradise fits into that.
Good question. What I don't mean is the world becomes paradise. I think some people have seen that title and they think, what is he talking about? Like,
Yeah,
once for
we're
a
getting
thousand years.
slaughtered in the streets.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff always going on in this world, and I
Yeah.
document it. I mean, the horror, the absolutely abominable practices of the Byzantine court at the heart of, Orthodox political life, it's just terrible. I mean, there's all sorts of bad stuff going on at all times. That's why the world can't be and will not be the Christian's final place. By paradise, I mean not that the world became paradise or paradise was somehow built. You can't do that. But paradise was brought through the Holy Spirit, through the incarnation of Jesus Christ into the world
Mhm.
in the body of Christ, whose head was Jesus, whose life with the Spirit was the Spirit, and especially in the liturgical sacramental life in concentration, paradise was started to fill the world with a heavenly immanence, I call it. You
Yeah, and
see
and it
this,
was the clear and focused mission of the church in focusing its members' attention on paradise, not on the
yes.
world. Like that was central to the understanding of the church and itself and its teachings in that time to a greater degree, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And I argue that having gone back to this deep past, the first millennium, we in the modern West find what we really need today, and that is a reverent understanding of a transfigured cosmos in which we live, where Christian worship is transformative, where heaven is on earth, where we really see and participate in the experience of paradise, even though we're not permanently attached to this world. It has come into the world through the life of the church. And I think that's very important going forward because the basic narrative of the remaining three volumes is how this began to disintegrate after the Great Schism, after the West became defined not by its traditional Christianity of the first millennium, what I consider to be Orthodox Christianity, East and West, in both Latin and Greek forms, and Celtic forms, by the way, and German forms, and so forth.
Scandinavian forms.
But what's that?
Scandinavian forms. It's still
Scandinavian
today in the
forms,
Danish
definitely.
passport. Actually, on the inside of our Danish passport, there's a carving in Denmark on a stone called the Jelling Stone, where there's an image of Christ, and it's a
Hmm.
very very interesting image of Christ. It looks nothing like the Christ you'll see today, but it's an incredibly Orthodox Christ, and there's a Viking kind of element to it as well. But we still have it,
Interesting.
and that's where the Danish nation was formed. That was the rock that basically founded the
Hmm.
Danish state. It says this rock was placed here by Harald Bluetooth, who Christianized the Danes, and it was the
Hmm.
first time that Christianity came to Denmark, and that's how, and still today it's in our passport. That is still the firm foundation of our identity as a nation of people, right? So
That's beautiful, and that needs to be remembered, and that's the deep past to which I think Danes need to go. And in my church here, we're doing a big iconography project in our ceiling, and part of it includes lines of saints, male and female, on either side of the church. Historically, men are on one side, women are on the other. They're both equally close to the altar, but they are distinct genders and sexes, and they don't interact during
During
worship, where they get disoriented from what they
yeah.
should be oriented toward. But on the male side, I have Saint Olaf of Norway with his axe in his hands,
Mhm.
saying, I'm quoting here Snorri a little bit, paraphrasing. He has a scroll in our icon that says something. It is a pity when young men of vigor do not recognize Christ as their creator, or something like that, referring to one of Olaf's lamentations about meeting a lot of pagan
Yeah.
warriors that were great warriors, but they refused to convert to Christianity as Olaf wanted them to.
Mhm.
Well, anyway,
Yeah. So
back
yeah,
to
we're in division and moving on to utopia, I guess, right?
yeah, yeah. So what happens is we have the Great Division. 1054 is the date that's convenient for historians to use to mark a significant event. Some people say, "Oh, it means nothing that the excommunication was issued by on the behalf of the Pope of Rome against the Patriarch of Constantinople in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople that day in 1054." I think it is significant. I think back to your question about what I'm trying to do with my project, what distinguishes this from a neutral or objective historical account, so-called purely scientific one, is that there's an ecclesial element in what I do. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I really believe that there needs to be an ecclesiological element to our vigorous witness to Christianity today, and to beliefs and values that will help restore the West in a healthy culture.
Mhm.
And there's an ecclesiological element to that, and it means something to have a division.
Mhm.
And so 1054 is the convenient date. It took, centuries for that really to all play out, but eventually you get two churches, as they're called today, the Orthodox Church of the East and the Roman Catholic Church of the West. And my second volume, Age of Division, taking up this what I call the Great Division of cultures, is a kind of a reflection and a study of what happens in the West to change the West from the very cosmologically affirmative and anthropologically positive culture of the first millennium into one that's increasingly cosmologically negative, cosmologically pessimistic, as well as anthropologically pessimistic. Of course, cosmology means how we understand the world.
Mhm.
Anthropology means how we understand what the human being in the world is. And what you find in what becomes the Roman Catholic culture of the so-called High Middle Ages is a very severe attitude, partly inherited from the Augustinian theology of the West, in distinct from the very different anthropology of the Greek fathers of the church, a severe understanding of the human condition.
Mhm.
Just to quote one, just to allude to one particular event, Pope Innocent III writes a work called on the misery of the human condition.
Mhm.
And he really reflects on, I talk about this in the book, especially Age of Utopia, quite a bit. It really sets a precedent, that important Pope. It was really influential work, really sets a precedent of how miserable this world really is.
Mhm.
And now traditional Christianity, Orthodoxy, for instance, said, yeah, the world is miserable in the sense that it's overrun by demonic forces, there's sin, there's darkness, but because of the incarnation by the Holy Spirit in the life of the church, especially its sacramental liturgical life, the world has been transformed by the presence of heaven on earth.
Mhm.
Something I pick up a lot about in the early the first volume is the architecture of liturgy, the central dome and heaven on earth, and the iconography showing forth the real presence of Christ and his saints that he abides in, and the sacramental experiences and all those things.
Mhm.
But in the second volume, Age of Division, and in this new Christendom of the West, I call it, you have a new culture that emerges, which is very pessimistic, anthropologically pessimistic. You find that in that work by Innocent III. You find it in a lot of the paintings of Jesus, where he's just in a ghastly form, bleeding and brutalized, and all sorts of mangled limbs and so forth. And that becomes the predominant vision of culture, or really an important contribution to the culture of the West and during that age of division. And the Protestant Reformation, when it comes, which I present as being really just a bookend to the papal Reformation that started the caused, in my judgment, caused the division in the first place. There was a reformational Christianity that began to look on the church in the world as something that needed constant changing and improvement. Whereas in that first millennium, and this continues in the old Christendom of the East during this second volumes period, you don't have that restless need to change and improve things, but you have this continued experience of communion with God, of this heavenly immanence, that the world is filled with heaven. And now that's more and more excluded in the West. Things like the doctrine of purgatory, or especially when you get the Protestant Reformation, of purgatory having separated the Christian from paradise, from eternal heaven, heavenly bliss, by what was often estimated to be thousands of years of hell-like punishment for their sins after they die.
Mm-hmm.
And so life in this world is tough, and then you die, and then you're, in purgatory, sent to purgatory. It really displaced this experience of paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to the Protestant Reformation and theologians like John Calvin, who really reduce the sacraments and really have a hostility toward this heaven on earth experience of worship. Iconography is out. There's all the famous, destruction of stained glass windows, and John Knox, the Calvinist, Scottish reformer, influenced the formation of the Church of England. Said Jesus, when it comes to the Eucharist, Jesus is in heaven and not here. Again, like that breaking of this heavenly immanence, that heaven is on earth. He was talking about the physical body of Jesus in the Eucharist.
Yeah, I was really thinking as I was reading about it as well, about how like the Orthodox Church, you have this resurrection icon with Christ like down in Hades, standing on these like doors that are knocked over. It's just, that is probably the central icon. What is this? It is the central icon of Easter, our largest celebration, and it's really the core icon of the church in so many ways. And for me, the equivalent in the Catholic Church is the crucifixion, and as you say, often like very, very suffering images of crucifixion. And of course, in Protestantism, you just remove Christ altogether; he's not even on the cross. You just have these like very bare and simple plain crosses as well, and so he's not even present anymore, because now we're going back to Old Testament, like no one can see God and live. Where he's like, okay, he's actually been incarnate, which that really hit me, because I went the first long time in my life, I grew up as a Protestant, I believed that, but then when someone said to me like, oh, well, we believe that Christ was incarnate, so we have seen him, we have met him, we have touched him, we have felt him. This is actually written in the Bible, in the Bible writings. It's him who we have experienced with our own.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yes. And you're right, in the community, the liturgical community, the body of Christ celebrating Pascha. I mean, I'm sure it's this way in your parish in Denmark, but certainly in our parish, by God's grace, and so many parishes I've been connected to here in America, there's nothing like Pascha. There's nothing like the middle of the night, the most inconvenient time of the day to worship, to assemble to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. There is such joy and energy and vigor in this celebration. It's just amazing. And I think about those images, you just reviewed some of that, history. I think that's the thing, is what happened in the so-called High Middle Ages. I say so-called because I don't accept that term as an Orthodox Christian. It's a Western, especially Roman Catholic thing, that there was a Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, you earlier referred to this model of history. We can call it the tripartite secular model of history, that you've got a pagan classical age, which generated all this great stuff about, life in this world. Then you've got the Middle Ages, right? That are characterized by Christianity. And then you've got the modern age, right, which is characterized by largely a repudiation of Christianity and a secularization of the world. And that is just absolutely not what historically, if we go back to the deep past, how people who living in the West understood the sequence of history. Not at all. There's two ages. There's the age before the incarnation, before heaven came to earth,
Mhm.
and then there's the second, the age of the church that'll be ended by the second coming of Christ, and
Yeah.
that age is filled with the presence of heaven on earth and the experience of paradise.
Yeah.
So that I just don't use those terms.
Yeah.
But if we return, Paul, to what you said there about the paintings and such, those paintings were designed, unlike the resurrectional icon you just spoke of, to provoke not a energetic joy, but a kind of withdrawn sadness and introspection and a largely emotional response to seeing Jesus suffering on the cross. Of course, Orthodox Christians are familiar with Jesus suffering on the cross. We have a tremendous, liturgical and artistic heritage of depicting Jesus on the cross and hymns about it.
Mhm.
But what happens after the Great Schism and the rise of this anthropological pessimism is that Jesus is depicted on the cross in a way designed to cause people to have an emotional response to it, to feel guilty of their sins, that they caused this to happen. And many have said that this, beginning with a lot of the Roman Catholic saints of the so-called High Middle Ages, this was designed to really create a human Christ as distinct from a divine Christ, and that Christ could be better understood by human beings in his human suffering rather than his divine power and victory
Mhm.
over death, where he breaks the bonds of hell, he kicks down the gates. I often say about those icons of the resurrection you're referring to, the descent into Hades, it's kind of like I don't know how much familiarity you have in your part of the world with this image, but it's kind of like the SWAT team. A SWAT is a term in
Yeah.
America for
Yeah,
a
we
special
we have
weapons.
all Hollywood definitely reaches here as well.
Yeah, okay, I'm sure it does. So the SWAT team, finding a crack house and rushing up the staircase of this crack house with that big telephone pole like piece
Yeah, battering
log
ram.
and knocking the door off of its hinges.
Mhm.
And it's very much Christ. You see him in that icon having kicked down the bronze gates of hell. You can even see the metal
No,
work, the
debris.
hinges and the chain all smashed and flying in the air and rushing in. And what do they do with the crack dealer they find? Well, they cuff him and they throw him on the floor. And you can actually see in many icons of Christ's descent into Hades, you can see the devil at the bottom in the darkness there underneath those broken gates, uh, hog-tied with his hands behind his back and naked and just completely overthrown,
Mhm.
completely, broken. And
Yeah.
there's a very, to use the term, masculine element to that. But if you go back to those images that predominate in the so-called High Middle Ages, you see so much of this kind of Christ just suffering, wounded, broken, the victim, right? And again, that's an important part of the Christian mystery of
Mhm.
Christ, but it's just a part. It can't be separated from the resurrection
Mhm.
from the dead. And that element is designed to cause people a much more kind of introspective, emotional, sentimental
Mhm.
response to Christianity. And that really weakened Christianity and made it to many people, and now we're coming to the third volume, like Petrarch, I think, very unhappy with the Christianity they knew. They wanted a more vigorous, strong Christianity. They
Mhm.
wanted something more joyful and something more affirmative about this world, something more optimistic about the human condition. And they weren't seeing that in all that focus on death and suffering. And so, since they didn't have access anymore to Orthodox Christianity and its anthropological optimism and affirmation of the world, they retreated to another a stage in the history of the West, and that's called humanism and the secularization of the world so that now it could seem transformative again. People could vigorously enter into building culture and being excited about living in this world. Uh, they couldn't do it as Christians, or at least as traditional Christians anymore. And that's the Renaissance and especially the so-called Enlightenment that comes and is documented in my books in the third volume, The Age of Utopia.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about the difference between these terms, paradise and utopia, and what's the difference between that? Because I found that really useful actually for understanding how paradise was replaced with utopia.
Yeah. Yeah. So my model is that again, the West was built on Christendom, Christendom being a civilization with a supporting culture that directs its members toward the heavenly transformation of the world. So it's
Mhm.
centered upon cosmology, what the world is, the cosmos is. Paradise being the model for that first millennium, that
Mhm.
paradise, not of this world, was manifested in this world. Heaven was on earth because of the life, liturgical, sacramental life of the church. When that was broken in the West by the Great Schism, the Great Division, 1054, and after centuries of what are called the Middle Ages in the Roman Catholic West and then the Protestant Reformation, there was such a negative view of the world and the human condition in this world that a new model, a new kind of mythos or myth of what the human condition was in this
Mhm.
world was needed,
Yeah.
and that became humanism. That
Yeah.
became humanism.
Yeah. Could you say there
And
was like an unmet yearning or a need that there's still that need was there, and so people had to find something else, and
yeah,
instead of going back to Eastern
absolutely.
Christianity, they then
Absolutely.
yeah.
I call it the transformational imperative. It runs through all four volumes.
Mhm.
The transformational imperative, something I think is unique to the West. You don't find it in Chinese or African or native Latin American cultures. You find it in Christendom. The
Mhm.
transformational imperative, where heaven and earth are met together with the second earth being transformed by its encounter with heaven, with the incarnate God. When that was disrupted by the Great Schism and the loss of contact with sacramental and ecclesial contact with the Orthodox Church, in my telling of the story, a substitute was needed. And this substitute became utopia. It became utopia, which is a counterfeit of paradise.
Mhm.
Utopia being a transformation of the world for its own sake, and no longer with reference to paradise or heaven, as understood through traditional Christianity and its worship. So now you have with the Renaissance, you have all the famous, beautiful paintings of Michelangelo and Raphael, and they're all documented in the Age of Utopia, where they break radically from what painting was before. Before it was liturgical, and now it's just art, really for its own sake. And then that expands tremendously in the Enlightenment with all the rise of secular arts like architecture. Palace of Versailles is it displaces cathedral architecture and paintings of the Venus displace paintings of the Virgin Mary. Now it's this erotic, feminine, sexual imagery that very worldly in character and no longer rooted in traditional Christianity that defines femininity in the West, Venus instead of the Virgin Mary. You see it in all sorts of ways. I spent a lot of time in that book talking about classical music and the transformation of music, how it goes from a liturgical purpose. Music is designed for worship, for liturgy, for worshiping God, to a very secular purpose, and that is to have no point of worship or contact with heaven at all, but just for its own sake in this world on earth. And that's secularization, of course. And here we have all the great composers of our Western heritage, about without whom I would be very impoverished because I love classical music. And
Mhm.
I just love it, and I love it all. And as well, at least from Mozart through, let's say, Mahler, I love classical music. From the late 18th century to the early 20th century. But this music too is largely, I mean, it's secular, right? It's no longer designed to direct the members of the West toward the heavenly transformation of the world. It's designed to direct the members of the West toward the secular transformation of the world, to find in the world all the resources, all the meaning, all the beliefs and values that
Mhm.
make human life meaningful and give definition to this community we call the West.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Almost trying to make like some kind of cheap copy, trying to take out all the elements of Christianity, but pretending that we don't, we don't need Christ. It's funny
It
how
is,
we
it's
see that all the time.
secularization, and utopia is, I say it in the books over and over again, is a counterfeit. I really like that word here. It's modeled on the original, but
Yeah.
it's not the original, and
Yeah.
it doesn't give human beings what they need. It doesn't even give the West what it needs, and that's why it runs out by the end of the 19th century in nihilism. The utopia collapses because the human being living in the West cannot be sustained by a completely immanent form of life with
Yeah.
no contact with the transcendent God, of the creator of this cosmos.
Yeah, but we're still reaching towards this transformational imperative. I just made a video, sorry, about the Olympics opening ceremony. I assume you've also seen that's been all over the
Yeah,
place in the recent conversations, where
so
they're still
unpleasant.
trying to pull on the last little pieces of the transcendence from the Last Supper, but then totally making this kind of terribly disgusting, blasphemical thing with a little child in there, and they can't stop themselves from following the same patterns. And then it's
Yeah.
like, oh no, yeah.
And I would say nihilistically, I would say, without any real belief in anything,
Yeah.
just, it's really nihilistic. Nihil being, the word nothing. There's no beliefs in a spectacle like that. Whereas in the age of utopia, so-called, as I call it, from the Renaissance to the Russian Revolution, there really is a strong conviction that there's something to be built, even if it's atheistic.
Yeah.
There's something to be built, or just secular in any case. And like, for instance, if you take the romantics of the early 19th century, they were painfully aware after the so-called Enlightenment that this absolute break from heaven, this loss of contact with the transcendent God, for Western culture was a crisis that had to be resolved. They tried to resolve it by making earthly things. I call it natural supernaturalism, after an historian who wrote a history of the Romantic movement. They tried to make earthly things the source
Mhm.
of a transcendent experience,
Mhm.
a transformative experience, and like with sexual love, for instance, but also nature worship or individual genius and individuality, and that fails. It just fails.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one can see this, at least I sense that one can see this on a personal level as well. I don't think, at least I haven't read it so much in your work as well, but I wonder if you have some thoughts about how a lot of the men that I see today and I work with today, and I can see it in my own life as well, these patterns of kind of like, intense inspiration and, working really hard to do something, and then kind of followed by periods of doubt and despondency and lack of direction, and knowing where to go. And it really, these ideas of paradise and utopia, or the orientation towards utopia, or and then the going over, noticing the abyss of nihilism or something like that. That seems to be playing out at a very much individual level. So I think men listening to this conversation might be able to recognize in their own lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so, Paul. And I think, two things that occurred to me there are, again, we just talked about the romantic quest for individual fulfillment in a lot of the culture of the Romantic age. That's the early 19th century, but it continues in the novels and such of the 19th century.
Mhm.
There's this idea of the individual finding purpose in life. Novels really become, in many ways, the alternative for spiritual literature for people in a secular utopia. And they're now using the novel to make sense of their life and define their goals and purpose in life. And that can't be, again, it's a counterfeit of what God made us for. God made every human being in his own image and likeness for a life of communion with him that finds its fulfillment in salvation, and without that, it's all counterfeit. And so the counterfeit culture of utopia was to create a purely secular version of that, which can satisfy no one permanently. And I think a lot of men today, I'm sure a lot of women too, but I would say a lot of men today are trying to find some purpose in their life as everything seems to disintegrate around them, trying to find a purpose for their life that, if it's secular, may inspire for a while and give an individual sense of purpose, but can't sustain itself without without that transcendence, without a contact with heaven. The
Mhm.
other thing I'd say in response to that, Paul, in addition to this counterfeit of a kind of individual fulfillment in the world,
Mhm.
I think is that we live in a disintegrating culture where nothing is really believed vigorously anymore. Nothing is really believed vigorously anymore.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, then we can find for a time something to really believe in and live our lives for, get excited about, dive in and get involved in. But it in the larger picture, it's ultimately nihil, nothing. It's meaningless by
Mhm.
itself
Mhm.
because it's all the invention of one's own self, and it doesn't have any claim to objectivity. It doesn't have any claim to transcendence. And that's really a painful situation for us to be in as a culture today, of individuals being unable to lock in, lock themselves into a transcendent way of life that's going to give them meaning, whether they wake up feeling meaningful or not. Because frankly, a lot of the Christian life is just enduring periods of a kind of emptiness, and that's just how it is. But we believe, we have convictions about our beliefs, that we are on track, that we are part of the body of Christ, that we are living a life of salvation through repentance, and that this is leading us ever closer to the kingdom of heaven.
I was thinking, yeah, so this distinction between the immanence and the transcendent aspects of God. Um, and as an Orthodox convert, someone coming into Orthodoxy, I kind of like, as you come in, you have this like insight about like how you're given a set of tools that can actually start shifting your mindset, your phronema or whatever it is, to
Mhm.
to a completely different way of seeing reality. And then it also seems like every time you think like, no, now you're getting it, then you realize like, well, there's just so much more to getting it as well, right? So um what I found really interesting was the kind of writings of St. Gregory Palamas and his conversations with this guy Barlam of Cumbria, I think. Is that a good model, you think, or that conversation for understanding like the difference between the paradisical and the utopian?
Well, maybe. Barlam is interesting. So this, you just referred to the 14th century
Yeah.
controversy around hesychasm, as it's known in the Orthodox tradition, which featured a Orthodox saint named Gregory Palamas, a Byzantine Greek Orthodox saint of that century, mid 14th century, 1300s, and how he was challenged and confronted by a theologian who came from the Italian West and was probably influenced by the rise of scholasticism, Aristotelian thinking about theology and stuff like this. And he really couldn't accept the that first millennium traditional Christian Orthodox understanding that heaven has really come into this world and transformed the human being in this world. This is
He
what
was even
Gregory
ridiculing it,
Palamas,
right?
yeah, he was ridiculing it. He was bringing attention to some practices of monks he heard about that, were breathing, controlling their bodily breathing and things like this in their experience of prayer and prayer of the heart, and he ridiculed it. And Gregory offers a very strong defense of this, and is vindicated by a council held at that time. And Barlam goes back kind of with his head, down, back to Italy. He eventually converts to Roman Catholicism at the end of his life. And at the very end of his life, and I'll throw this in because I can't resist it, he actually becomes a tutor in the Greek language to the father of humanism, Petrarch,
Mhm.
in Italy in that 14th century. And Petrarch, of course, is the one who's instrumental. I talk a lot about him in the early parts of the Age of Utopia, instrumental in bringing the West away from a Christian toward a secular understanding of things. So to generalize, I think you could say that the Orthodox Church gives us all these tools, all these resources for transforming our life. And if you look at the Hesychast controversy, Gregory Palamas was a good reminder that it's an endless process of transformation that begins in this age, but will continue in the age to come. Orthodox fathers of the church say heaven is not like we pass some sort of test of our faith, or we escape hell because of Christ's crucifixion alone and nothing that we really do, something like this, and that we acquire heaven and we just kind of stand there and for all eternity in that state. Orthodox fathers said it's a transformative process even in heaven.
Mhm.
That yes, this age is all transformative, but it'll continue. That since God is infinite light, infinite love, infinite peace, infinite beauty, we
Mhm.
will just be filled with that beauty, love, light, and peace eternally. It'll just grow and grow and grow and grow in us.
Mhm.
And that's what heaven will be like. And so those tools we have as Orthodox Christians, prayer, fasting, confession,
Mhm.
regular Eucharistic communion, apologizing to our wives and children, on a daily basis, praying together,
Mhm.
things like this. These are all good things, and help us move forward in that ever changing, ever transfiguring life of salvation.
Mhm. Okay, so Father John,
So I don't know if I
we're
got
heading.
I don't know if I got to the core of your question there about if it was about how orthodoxy provides modern men with an ability to kind of like undertake this life of meaning, this
Yeah,
life of purpose,
yeah,
and not be kind of wandering around trying to find meaning and then finding these periods of dull
yeah.
apathy and so on.
Maybe I can sharpen it a bit for you then as well. I want to get to Augustine actually before we run out of time, but
Okay.
let me just do a little bit more on this one. Because so I'm busy reading St. Joseph the Hesychist right now as well. And this is a guy who really dedicated his life in an incredibly vigorous way to seeking God's will and to seeking God and to seeking a real meeting with God as well. And from everything we know about him, it's very obvious like he found something incredibly powerful. Um, but for myself, I'm a lay person, and so that's something that I often struggle with, and kind of because while he's able to just focus like laser sharp on one thing, I have to worry about a lot of things. And of course, there's some ways in which I can focus on one thing through all of that, but it's not easy to understand how orthodoxy helps the layperson to have this personal, imminent meeting with Christ.
hmm When we read people like Joseph the Hesychast, and there's so many 20th century fathers, some of them canonized saints of the ascetical tradition of Orthodoxy, we're blown away by their asceticism, by the uncompromising vigor of their pursuit of the kingdom of heaven. They were satisfied with nothing short of communion with God. And so we who are living in the world, and I'm with you, obviously, Paul. I'm a parish priest. I'm not a monk. So, I have a wife. I have 5 children. I have all the things, that go into family life that brings. And my parish, is a parish of lay people, of course, where I'm not caring for a monastic brotherhood where, everyone is, living the monastic life. We're all here together living in this world and with all the things going on in this world. It's difficult for me too, of course, obviously, and to apply a lot of that teaching, that uncompromising vigor to my life. But what's wonderful, I find, personally speaking here, that we have that resource that's there from really 2 millennia of fathers and mothers of the church who have delivered to us a way of life that keeps everything completely focused on the end, which is the kingdom of heaven. And that ascetical tradition of the Orthodox Church, which lives itself out in your life and my life by the fact that we fast for 40 days before Easter or Pascha every year, we fast for 40 days before Christmas. I mean, talk about a countercultural thing, in our society today. I don't know what it's like in Denmark. In America, people just start partying. They even have a solemn, a counterfeit feast day called Black Friday, the day after American Thanksgiving, where everyone wakes up stuffed from eating a lot of turkey to go shopping for Christmas things. And they begin this kind of, it's almost it's like an anti-liturgical season when the Orthodox Church historically was always beginning a fast during this 40 days before Christmas to get ready for the incarnation. Now it's a celebration time. People are fed up with celebrating by the time Christmas arrives. They're worn out, they're hungover, they're overweight, they're tired of all the Christmas songs that they've heard, and they want to throw their Christmas tree into the dumpster the next day. Um, so we have this tradition in the Orthodox Church. That's why I say that the West really needs this now, of an ascetical tradition that even lay people participate in. It's not like it's optional. It's not like only monks do this kind of thing. Every Orthodox Christian baptized and chrismated into the Orthodox Church is called to this. Now, there are individual cases where children or the elderly or people with, diabetes or something like that are going to have to do things a little different. But there's one common expectation and path, that leads toward the proper celebration of the incarnation of God. And that's what we have. And so I don't think that we should despair that we read someone like Joseph the Hesychast and think, how can I ever even come close to that? He came close to that because God gave him the talent and the gift to become a monk and to do what he did. And God gave you and me the talent and gifts to be to become saints in the life that we live. And that's going to involve some level of what Joseph the Hesychast experienced, as well as we see the retention of all of these feasts and fasts and expectations of prayer and forgiveness and charity and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a needed message today. I think men are tired of, there's nothing for them to do. There's everything's just provided. And I think that's what I've really found is like that message of Orthodox Christianity, that there's actually a standard and we strive towards that. And obviously each of us have different talents, but we're invited to give our all actually, and nothing less than that. And that's what we can. And all of us will fall and fail. But as we reach towards it. Father John, I'm actually thinking that I want to talk to you more about classical music because we spoke about classical music before we started recording. I was really enjoying it. And maybe we need to save St. Augustine for another conversation as well, because I think if we go diving into that. So
Sure,
maybe this is
sure.
a good place actually to finish this conversation and then follow up with a version 2 for for doing a little bit more. So yeah, is there anything that you feel from this conversation that we can round it off with, and where do we kind of leave what yeah, from everything that's we've said so far?
Yeah. Well, I think your channel is just a wonderful channel. It really is providing something to people who really need that today. Men, a lot of young men, but a lot of men who are later in life too, have been cheated and disappointed by the culture of the West as we now see it. You mentioned this recent thing that just happened the other day with the Olympics opening ceremonies. It's just a shame. It's vile. It's just vile. And we live in a culture that more and more is not only drawn toward, but even celebrating vileness and a lack of purpose and a lack of what it really means to be human as a man, as it become means to be human to be a woman as well. And I think what we want to do is we want to just remember that we shouldn't despair, that God is with us, that God is always reaching out to us, that we're not left on our own to try to figure this stuff out, to drift into some sort of super masculine ideology, which, becomes really unpleasant and something like that, but to be grounded in that transcendent purpose that God gives us. We don't give it to ourselves. We don't invent it in the absence of obvious patterns of living our life, but God gives it to us to live our lives for communion with Him and for love for our neighbor as ourself. And that is found in traditional Christianity. And I think a lot of what men are facing today in the world that we live in, 21st century America, Denmark, anything in the West, is that we've been through so many phases of disintegration, beginning with secularization. Let's point to that. And this counterfeit model of life that I call utopia, that has played itself out in movements, that are like feminism, for instance, has really confused a lot of where the place of the man is in our society. And then the transgender movement today is, of course, even more bizarre than anything, even the most radical feminism could have ever achieved. We need to return to a deep past, to that deep past in which a healthy culture of the West was to be found in man's communion with God. And that's kind of where I what I would like to say to your audience, and again, commending you for this good work you're doing, bringing attention to a lot of different important issues that men face today.
Well, thank you for
Yeah.
that, John. I got to say, it's been an incredible privilege to talk to you. Just this first conversation, and your books have been a very big help, because I really do think, it's absolutely true. Like, we need to understand where we come from in that deep past in order to be able to understand where we were going. Until we know what's happened before and how we got here, then we don't know how to move forward. And so some of a really big step of retracing the past has been through reading your works. I will say that sometimes I get really depressed because, as you say, it's just been this like series of disintegrations that have just been happening again and again and again and again. But then, I stand in front of my Ankin corner and I'm like, God, I can't do this. Like, what am I going to do with I have a 3-year-old and I have a 1-year-old. Like, what am I going to do about sending them? I got to send them to a school somewhere, if I can't homeschool them
Oh,
all. But then it's like, well, I can't do it. God, like, help me. Um,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
and
Well,
then
along the way, there is always this thing I keep on quoting. I do in my introduction to the whole series, and I do it in the series conclusion at the end of volume 4, and that is the words of an Orthodox theologian of the 20th century, George Florovsky, who was himself a historian, wrote a great history of the Russian Orthodox Church, and he said, "History is a tragedy, but it is a creative tragedy for the Christian." And that is that, we Christians, we're never defeated. Christ is with us. God is with us. Understand, all you nations, and submit yourselves, for God is with us. We sing it at the celebration of the incarnation of Jesus at Great Compline on the eve of Christmas and then Theophany. We really believe, taking it from the scriptures, of course, that God is with us, and we cannot be defeated as long as God is with us and we seek to be with him. So whatever darkness we see, there's also light to be seen.